Clinical and director of the Health Justice Clinic at Duke Law School. And I'm so excited to welcome you to our Teaching Justice webinar series and the first one for the 2024 semester. Today's session is Teaching Critical Clinical Frames, featuring Kris Henning and Eduardo Ferrer, both Georgetown University Law Center. We're so excited for you to join us today.
Hi, everyone. I'm Layla Halas. I'm a clinical professor of law at Tulane Law School and a member of CLIA's Best Practices in Pedagogy Committee. As usual, we want to let you know that today's talk is part of our Teaching Justice webinar series, which is part of CLIA's Best Practices Committee. And our goal is just to have these ongoing conversations from innovative faculty members talking about new approaches to teaching justice in the classroom, drawing from the wisdom of current social movements and thinking about intersections with a variety of topics: criminal justice, immigration, racial justice, economic justice, through all of these different lenses. And we want you to stay tuned. We have a really great lineup this fall. Please continue to check out the CLIA website and look at all of our listservs for more updates and information on how to register. And I'll hand it back to Allison.
Great. So you have probably seen already that this session is being recorded, and like most of our sessions, we are going to make that recording available on the CLIA website. So please stay tuned also for instructions on how to access that. But you can go to Teaching Justice on CLIA and find our amazing lineup from the last few years, and also what is sure to be an outstanding presentation today. For the presentation, we encourage you to interact using the chat function. And in fact, the presenters may be sending some questions or inviting some feedback over chat during the presentation. If you have a question, feel free to raise it using the chat function. And we also will make time during the presentation at the end, I believe, to answer questions using the video function. We're going to ask everybody, if they haven't already, to mute your microphones, please, for the presentation. But if you're comfortable, the presenters would really love and welcome you to keep your video on during the session. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kris and Eduardo. Thank you again so much for joining us today.
All right. Well, thank you both, Layla and Allison, for having us. Thank you all for hosting the entire Teaching Justice webinar series. We are honored to be here and to join the conversation. I am Kris Henning, or Kristen Henning. I go by Kris. I am the director of the Juvenile Justice Clinic and Initiative at Georgetown Law School. I co-teach with Wally Malinik and Eduardo Ferrer, and Professor Ferrer is here and will introduce himself.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here with you all. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Eduardo Ferrer, and I'm a visiting professor in the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic and the policy director of our initiative. Looking forward to being here with you all today.
All right. And Eduardo is advancing our slides for both of us. So I want to start, as Eduardo and I just said, we work together in the Juvenile Justice Clinic, and our core work with the law students involves representing children, meaning youth typically under the age of 18 with crime and delinquency in our local courthouse. And we represent children charged with anything from assaults, robberies, gun possession, car theft, and much more. Because our critical clinical frames that we're going to be talking about for the next hour evolved over time, over a number of years, from the patterns and the themes that we were seeing in our cases with our clients, we thought it would be really important to start today's discussion with an example of a typical case that we have in the clinic. So what I want to do is to tell you about a young girl that we represented here in Washington, D.C., and we call her Kayla for purposes of this discussion. So Kayla was a 17-year-old African-American girl who lived with her mother in a predominantly Black neighborhood in the District of Columbia. She was a 10th grade student at the time at a local DC public high school. She enjoyed school, attended school virtually every day, and earned mostly B's and C's. She also had an IEP for emotional disturbance. Socially, Kayla was active on the dance team. She liked spending time at night with her friends, at her friends' houses, hanging out with her first serious boyfriend, D'Angelo, was also another one of her sort of key pastimes. Now, D'Angelo was a charismatic 17-year-old boy who liked the attention that he received at school, like most teenagers, right? And he especially liked the attention he was receiving from girls. So at the time of our case, Kayla had recently been hearing rumors that D'Angelo was, quote unquote, talking to some other girl. She was upset by the rumors. She confronted D'Angelo. And during that confrontation, right, during the lunch period, Kayla grabbed her boyfriend's cell phone out of his hand and began scrolling through his text messages while she walked away down the hall. A school resource officer saw this interaction and decided to intervene by stepping in front of Kayla as she was walking away. The school resource officer claims that he had observed prior arguments between Kayla and D'Angelo in the past, and he didn't want them to continue disturbing the schools, as he put it. When Kayla tried to walk past the officer grabbed her arm, and as Kayla then pulled away from the officer and began to run away down the hall, the officer chased her, caught up to her, and tackled her to the ground in a takedown, basically. As he was trying to put her in handcuffs, Kayla continued to struggle and made it difficult for him to handcuff her. The officer ultimately arrested Kayla. And I have to tell you all, Kayla was formally prosecuted the next day by the local prosecutor's office. She was prosecuted for robbery, for taking the property of another without permission by snatching, right? She was also charged with resisting arrest. I should also note that she was suspended from school. And so during our initial interview with our client, Kayla, we learned that Kayla's father had passed away when she was 4 years old. She didn't remember much about her father, but she remembered that he had passed away. She also told us that her mother struggled with depression, struggled with the substance abuse after her father died. And then finally, she shared that she had been living in a series of group homes and foster homes in the child welfare system for the last several weeks due to allegations of physical abuse by her mother. In her delinquency case, at that very first hearing, as we indicated, she's charged with robbery and resisting arrest. And Kayla's social worker from the neglect hearing shows up in the delinquency case and asks the judge to detain Kayla, securely detain Kayla in a juvenile detention facility because of outbursts that Kayla had been having, abscondances that Kayla, because Kayla had also been absconding for a number of child welfare placements. You should also know that Kayla had no prior delinquency cases. She told us that she wanted to go home. She wanted to live with her mother, despite the fact that there had been allegations of abuse. So that's a pretty lengthy story with a lot of richness to it. What I want to do, though, is we're not going to we're going to talk to you because we know it's lunchtime and you want your time to just listen, but we also want to engage with you just a little bit. And we want to engage with you by just having you, if you will, just to briefly type in the chat. You've heard this story. And even if you came in late and heard parts of the story, what I want you to type into the chat is just very briefly, even one word, 2 words, what bothered you about that story right from the outset? What bothered you about Kayla's story and what we told you about how she ended up being our client? And Eduardo is going to read what he sees in the chat. So give it a second for you guys to.
I see the adultification of Black girls, the fact that she
Yes.
was charged, not developmentally appropriate response, the fact that there were SROs in the school to begin with,
Yes.
ignorance of her trauma, the use of violence by the SRO against Kayla, overly punitive response, the
Yes.
so-called intervention of the SRO, escalation by those in charge.
Yes. Excellent. So I just want all of you collectively to come and testify before our city council and to be witnesses in our delinquency case. But putting that aside, absolutely, you all have nailed all of the things that were of grave concern to us as faculty in the clinic watching this, that have been grave concerns to the students with whom we work, and to the clients and their families whom we serve. And I should tell you that Kayla's story is a composite, I should say, of 2 clients that we represented in the clinic, but absolutely 100% representative of the clients and the challenges they face when they appear in court. And so the issues that you identified are absolutely right. And let me say this to you, our client population is 100% adolescent or children and adolescents. And I should say almost 100% because we do have some children who stay with us beyond their adolescence if they remain in the legal system beyond that. Our clients are almost, at this present moment, African American. We actually don't really even have Latinx youth in our client population anymore, although we did at the start of our for many years at the start of our clinic. Our clinic is the clients in our clinic are also almost entirely, if not the vast majority of them, have some major trauma in their lives, and all of them are grappling with critical adolescent issues like adolescent identity development. Okay, so for us, these 4 recurring themes: adolescence, race, trauma, and identity development, which we specifically, as one of you noted, the adultification of Black girls, we grapple with as SOGI, right? As both gender identity and expression, but also sexual orientation. These are the dominant frames. To be clear, they are not the only frames that we see, not the only themes, if you will, that we see in our client population, but they are the dominant themes. So the very next exercise that we would quickly like to do with you is that we want to give you an opportunity to do this with your own clinics. And so what do I mean by that? I just mean that we want you to type in the chat 3, maximum 4 words that would describe your clients, right, as a collective, the primary, dominant, recurring characteristics of your clients or of the client population you serve through your project-based work or your organizational clients. So we're going to give you literally like a little quick write. It is a clinical webinar. I promise you there will be no small groups. There will be no breakout sessions, but we will give you a moment for just a 2-minute quick write so you can just get your head around this. And whenever you're ready, just drop in the chat 3 words, no more than 4, that describe your clients or the client population you serve through your project work or your organizational work. Mm. This is great. We're intentionally not reading them out loud. Please feel free to read as they're coming through. Great. All right. So we want you to just sit with these, hold space with these throughout the rest of the webinar. And we're going to begin to unpack, give definitions and layering. And really, after we do some of that definitions and explanation and layering, then we're going to talk about how we apply them in the clinical course, in all aspects of the clinical course. So I'll kick it over to Eduardo to take it from here.
Great, thank you. And I very much encourage folks, the descriptions that folks are putting into the chat are powerful, and it will help set the stage for what we talk about as potential frames for clinics to look at adopting for their own clinic. And so what we'll do is we'll start with a little bit of the theory of what we call pedagogical frames, and then back into the more practical and explain why and how we use them. So this notion of frames for us really comes from some of the research done in the fields of communications and rhetoric. And in particular, there's a researcher named Jim Coopers who describes framing from a rhetorical perspective as a process whereby communicators, either consciously or unconsciously, act to construct a point of view that encourages the facts of a given situation to be interpreted by others in a particular manner. And the reality of it is that frames also, we use them, whether consciously or unconsciously, to interpret a situation for ourselves. So frames, according to Coopers, operate in 4 key ways. They help us define problems, diagnose causes, make moral judgments, and suggest remedies. And frames are often found within a narrative account of an issue or event, and are generally the central organizing idea. So they're literally the prism or the lens through which we are interpreting a given situation. Framing analysis then is kind of taking a step back and thinking of it on a more meta level, right? Framing analysis then is the intentional recognition and consideration of the frames or schema that we ourselves or others are using to make meaning of a situation, of data, of information, of evidence, right? They're essentially used to try and order and make sense of the information or the situation that we're encountering, okay? Pedagogical frames then are central organizing ideas that we provide to students that encourage students to intentionally and critically examine and interpret everything that they are encountering through these frames in furtherance of their representation of their client's expressed interest, okay? So it's a central organizing idea that's really used not as the end in and of itself, but to further clients' expressed interests. And in trying to help make sense of this notion of a pedagogical frame, we really break it down into 5 key elements or key components, okay? So the most obvious or the most central really is the schema of the frame itself. And the schema is the central idea, theory, construct, or theme through which we encourage students to filter and organize information, okay? And we'll unpack this in a little bit more detail, but broadly speaking, we think of frames in 2 broad categories. There are experiential schema, and there are structural schema, okay? And experiential schema relate to the structure of the experience that individuals have at any moment in their lives, whereas structural schema are organized around more abstract themes, and they relate more to the structure of social life, and as a result can cut across experiential frames. And I'll break these down in a little bit more detail and give some examples. But these schema, really, we construct them through a couple of different ways. We construct them using social science. So we use a lot of research to help explain and ground how the experience of our young people, according to what the research shows. We also use the lived experience of our clients. They're the experts on their lives. And so that in many ways informs how we construct and encourage students to construct the schema. And then the last is through critical legal theory itself and all of its kind of subcategories. So what's the legal critique or the critique of the law as it pertains to race, as it pertains to gender and sexual orientation, as it pertains to adolescence? And so really the schema is the central part of the frame and often how we name the frame to begin with. Frames, and I suspect that all of us use these schema already in our clinics in some way, shape, or form. We've gotten a lot of feedback from folks as we've presented and as the paper got published that they're doing some form of this already. Part of what we do then is we name it, right? We're clinicians, and so we name it and we make it explicit. And the reason for this is twofold. One is it really improves client advocacy. So it helps students develop additional tools, additional ways of thinking about the work that improve their ability to persuade others. And it adds additional layers to learning that we can explore through the coursework and through the client representation. And this naming really happens on two levels, right? So one is just practical. We name the frames because often we're using them unconsciously already, or others are using them unconsciously already. And so we want to make them visible, right? And what this does is it models intentionality in how we approach understanding a particular situation, as well as to how we approach persuasion. The second piece of this is really on the metacognitive level. So we're trying to help students understand this process of frame analysis and how to use this process of frame analysis so that they can learn to identify, analyze, and select frames themselves, as well as deconstruct, shift, or reinform the frame selected by others, right? And so in an ideal world, students should both be able to critique the specific frames that we've chosen for them or for our course, as well as select their own frames in individual cases that will advance clients' express interest. Third, and this is really, really important so that we don't fall into the same traps of folks using frames unconsciously, right? Is that frames are a tool, right? They are not the end in and of itself. We are express interest advocates, right? And so frames are really a tool for deeper understanding of our clients, their cases, the facts, the law, the way it's applied. It's a tool for persuasion, for narrative construction and deconstruction, and it's a tool for meaning making, okay? And because it's a tool and it's a means to an end, not the end in and of itself, it's also a great way to help students understand strategy and backwards design, right? How do we accomplish our goal, and how might the frames help us get there or not, right? We don't argue frames in every case. They're used very intentionally and strategically to advance the client's express interests. Fourth, frames are critical, right? So it's both the process of understanding, identifying, and analyzing the frames chosen by others, as well as reflecting on the frames that the students themselves might be using, right? And it's this critical analysis piece, really getting students to focus on that critique piece. That's critical. And then the last element is that they're pervasive, right? So we really encourage students to apply them to everything that they encounter in clinic. The law, facts, root causes, solutions, relationships, values, clients' experiences, right? And in this way, frames become a metaframe in and of themselves, right? It becomes a methodology for confronting the false claims of the neutrality, the certainty, the replicability of the law and the systems and the people that enforce both, right? It also frames become a practice, a mode of moving through the world, a tool, right, for how they provide that structure for engaging in critical legal praxis. And so Kris is going to explain the 4 frames that we've chosen for our clinic specifically.
Yeah, so we want to do just a little deeper dive about the frames that we chose and why we chose them and how we developed them so that they can be conveyed and discussed with our students. And so just for a moment, if we think back to Kayla's story, right, we immediately recognize, and all of you immediately recognize, that Kayla was being viewed by all of the system's actors from some lens, right? Whether or not they were aware of it or not. When I say that, they, meaning the prosecutor, the school resource officer, the teacher, the social worker, all of them were viewing Kayla from a particular lens. And in fact, everyone in this particular case was viewing Kayla from the lens of a delinquent, right? This child who was acting out, misbehaving, creating a disturbance, right? And so because delinquency became the dominant frame through which everyone else in the system was viewing her, it was easy for them to ignore or dismiss or, as the theory talks about, make invisible the other central aspects of who this child is, right? The trauma, the fact that she was a child in and of itself. The others in the system were able to distill, or to reduce is the word I'd use here, reduce her to the narrative of an angry Black girl, a woman scorned, an oppositional and defiant teen, a child who never learned right from wrong, and a girl who was too fast, or a Jezebel, promiscuous, right? So that's the narrative through which she was being viewed. And so our frames, right, as Eduardo noted, is helping our students recognize that the law is not viewing Kayla from a lens of neutrality, and that we needed to identify and empower frames that could help us in furtherance of our client stated interests. And so as you can see on the chart, and as I have already really indicated, our 4 frames are adolescence, race, trauma, and the SOGI lens. And we look to social science, critical legal theory, as Eduardo has said, and our clients' lived experience for inspiration in developing our 4 frames. Think about adolescence for a second. I recognize many of your faces on this call, and I know that we are all aware there's plenty of research on adolescence and its meaning in a legal context, right? We look at that adolescent research or the concepts of adolescence from 3 frames or subframes, if you will. And by that, I'm talking about normative adolescent development, referring to just the set of common milestones and experiences and characteristics of adolescence. We're talking about neurological immaturity, meaning the empirical recognition that the brain is not fully formed until our mid-20s, with the region of the brain being that's responsible for executive functioning being the last development. And then finally, psychosocial immaturity, recognizing that even when a child reaches cognitive maturity around age 16, young people still don't develop or still have not developed the same psychosocial maturity as adults until much closer to the age 25. As a result, they are impulsive, focused on short-term rewards, less averse to risks, or not thinking ahead to the long-term consequences, more susceptible to the influence of their peers, diminished decision-making capacity, the list, right? And so then we began to think about, well, how do we apply that frame to each of our cases, again, in furtherance of Kayla's expressed interest, right? So in this case, there's absolutely no factual dispute that Kayla took the phone. So the real question, or one of the many real questions, is what do we do with Kayla? What does the school do with Kayla? The adolescence frame really helps us push back on that criminalization of normal adolescent behavior. And I'm putting race aside to a second. We'll get to that. But the criminalization of normal adolescent behavior, we're using that frame to push back on that. It also helps us with the guilt innocence question, right? If we recognize, or if Kayla is charged with robbery, which requires a showing of specific intent to steal, when viewed from the lens of adolescence, we can argue that Kayla's behavior is indeed all that we know about adolescence: impulsive, emotional. It's about that immediate gratification. It's about the fact that adolescents are fairness fanatics. And it's not about a desire to deprive him of that property or to break the law. And in fact, we know that he's going to get his phone back, right? Probably in minutes after this argument. Also it helps us, the adolescence frame hopefully helps us with mitigation at the time of detention and at disposition if we should lose such a case, right? All right. The second frame is race, right? Again, we draw from social science and the lived experiences of our client in developing that foundation for that race frame, right? The race frame has two broad interrelated concepts at a minimum. One is implicit racial bias and what we call policing as trauma, meaning the science of, or the empirical studies on the traumatic effects of over-policing of communities of color, right? And so there's such a growing body of research documenting the ways in which Black and brown youth who have significant contact with the police, who live in heavily surveilled neighborhoods or who attend heavily surveilled schools have heightened risk or experiences of stress, fear, depression, insomnia, shame, hypervigilance. And so again, we could take that race frame and talk to our students, work with our students about how to use that frame to recharacterize, right, the narrative that has been put forth by the government, by the police officer, by the social worker, all in furtherance of our client's expressed interest, right? We have to ask the question, would this incident, would Kayla have been arrested if she were a white student in a predominantly white school, right? With the exact same facts. And so we use the race frame again to convince maybe the prosecutor to dismiss through negotiation, right? We use the race frame to help us educate the rest of the system's actors on why the school resource officer may have interpreted Kayla's behavior as more aggressive, violent, criminal than it actually was. The race frame also helps us understand Kayla's response of pulling away from the officer, running from the officer, and being absolutely terrified when the officer, was in pursuit of her and tackled her to the ground. And that helps us, again, at that guilt innocence frame. Is this self-defense? Is this self-preservation and not, violence? All right. So you see how we use the race frame. The trauma frame, I think, is obvious as well, relying on social science, scientific research, not only to understand that traumatic effects of policing that I already discussed, but also to understand the impact of childhood chronic stress and toxic stress on adolescent development, right? And so the trauma helps us really understand how that research helps us understand that truly trauma is really the norm within the lived experience of our clients in the delinquency system and not an exception. And so that helps us with disposition planning. And if the question is, what do we do with her, right? The worst thing that we could do with a child who has been traumatized, right, is to continue to engage with them as if they are delinquent and criminal, using detention and commitment to longer term facilities, right? So the question becomes, how do we help her heal and how do we help her become whole? So using that frame, naming something that I think we all do in our practice, as Eduardo says, but really naming it both for the students, but also for the other systems actors in the system. It really breaks down that victim offender dichotomy. And I should just note, for a moment, that the trauma frame really I'm sorry, let me say this, the adolescence frame really focuses on those objective standards, like the reasonable person in the law, right? It helps us break down the reasonable man, the reasonable adult white male. The trauma frame does more than that. It actually allows us to focus on the individual client's subjective perspective in our work, right? So objective versus individualized, subjective really becomes useful here. All right. All right. All right. One other thing that we thought was really important we want to say about trauma before we speak on the last frame is that while Kayla's trauma history and trauma frame helps us better understand our clients, no one frame defines her or predicts her future, right? So it's really important in thinking about our frames not to ascribe or over attach meaning to any one frame, but to have it be named and recognized in a way, again, that furthers our client's interest. And then finally, the SOGI frame, sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, again, social science, lived experiences of our clients really helped us develop and think through this frame. And we'll say this, I think this is one, as Eduardo says, that the students should push back on us. I think students in many ways are often very far beyond us when we teach frames, the SOGI frame. And so really having them educate us, meta-frame us, meta-critique us, this is one of those spaces where in our reflection as teachers that we often come back to and talk about how much we've learned about this frame from our students, right? But our key here is to really understand and affirm the various dimensions of identity, especially as it relates to gender and gender identity and expression, and to acknowledge and resist the individual and systemic biases that are often attached to gender and other identity frames, including cis girls. We've already talked about the adultification of Black girls, LGBTQ plus status, cis boys even, because in our work, we're working with almost exclusively, or not almost exclusively, but a heavy population of adolescent Black males, right? And so then we're dealing and grappling with that Black masculinity narrative, right? That is used so negatively and harmfully against our African-American clients, right? And then the final thing I think it's worth saying here is that, or the final two things is, one is the importance of intersectionality. So I've talked about these four frames as if they exist on their own, but you can't not talk about them at their intersections, right? The fact, for example, that many of our LGBTQ youth have also lived with trauma, especially those youth who are in the delinquency system, that are adolescent girls, or no child in our clinic is defined by any one demographic. So their gender and their race and their trauma work together in each of these frames. The final word that I'll say about this is the question of how do we choose our frames? And to be quite frank, it's simple as this. It's prevalence, power, and privilege. No, prevalence, power, and principle. See, I messed up my P's here. But prevalence, power, and principle. Prevalence, just obviously everything that we've been talking about. These are our clients. The prevalence of these frames in our clients' lives and in our work. Power is the recognition that these particular frames, these four frames, can be powerful, as Eduardo said, tools to advance our clients' expressed interest when used strategically and intentionally. And then principle. Principles, by that we mean they reflect the values that we as teachers want to convey in our clinic, right? So we chose these frames not only because they provide those additional tools of advocacy, but also because we care about youth justice, we care about racial justice, we care about reparative justice, meaning healing of young people who have been traumatized, and we care about gender justice. All right. We do not argue every frame in every case. We evaluate every frame in individual cases and individual conversations with clients, and make strategic decisions about when to use them. Right. So I will kick it back to Eduardo.
And we're going to come back to where we started with the prompt and thinking about the frames that you all are starting to identify or have identified both implicitly and explicitly for your own clinics, and a recognition that there are so many other frames that could be applied, right? There are so many other frames that we could apply in our clinic as well, a disability lens, a poverty lens. And so there's no right or wrong frame. The key really is about intentionally approaching this pedagogy, the use of pedagogical frames for your own clinic if you think it would be helpful. And as you're brainstorming, as you're thinking about that, there are two routes that you could potentially go depending on the type of your clinic. As we mentioned before, there's experiential frames and then there's structural frames, right? And so experiential frames, we've got some examples listed. Many of them are ones that folks identified earlier in the chat, beyond the 4 frames that we use in the juvenile justice clinic, right? It's things like race, ethnicity, language, citizenship, trauma and resilience, disability, poverty, the life stage, right? It may not be that you represent adolescents, but you may represent folks above the age of 60, and they're at a very different life stage with different needs. Behavioral health issues, right? All of these are different frames that you could intentionally layer on to the work of your clinic and to the client advocacy. We chose experiential frames for our clinic in large part because it centers the client. So it's reflective of the work that we do in the juvenile justice clinic, both in terms of centering the client, but also in terms of what is going to help us most effectively advocate for the client in an individual case. So these are examples of experiential frames, but you could also use structural frames, right? And structural frames cut across in many ways the various experiential frames. So you may have clients that cut across race. You may have clients that cut across life stage. You may have clients that cut across SOGI, but you see these broader themes that emerge across all of your clients. Issues of power, right? Maybe you're a policy clinic and what you see really comes down to how power is distributed, where power has been grounded historically. What's the claim to power that folks make across race, across life stage, across sexual orientation? So you may see these key themes cut across. You may see essentialism in your clinic, right? The flattening of clients, the reduction of clients' experiences to one dimension, and the weaponization of that against clients. Or you may see epistemic issues. You may see issues relating to essentially authority, right? Who has knowledge? Who has the truth, or whose truth is really validated and held up above others? There's some great work, I think, being done on this issue in the family policing space, for instance, right? Whose truth are we holding up when making decisions in that space? So as you're thinking about the possibility of using frames in your clinic, in addition to the particular frame, it's a helpful exercise to start with in thinking about, do I want to maybe narrow and focus on experiential frames, or might I focus more on structural frames, more abstract themes that cut across a number of different kind of vertical. I think about it as vertical and horizontal. Vertical being related to the client, horizontal cutting across clients or client populations. And for us, there are really two big justifications for using frames in a clinic overall. One is that they're client-centered, and two is that they're really student-centered, right? So in terms of being client-centered, what they do is that they really encourage students to be curious, to dig deeper into clients' experiences, into their own relationships with their clients, into clients' relationships with other stakeholders, and to reflect and critique the systems, the law itself, right? So students are often afraid to pry. They don't want to know or ask about past trauma, mental health, disabilities. But the frames help them understand the importance of, if it's not prying directly with the client, it's getting school records, it's getting behavioral health records, it's doing additional investigation, not just about the facts of the case, but about the facts of the client, to be able to best advocate for them and achieve their expressed interest. It also helps them really understand where clients coming from in ways. So we talk often about parallel universe thinking in clinic, right? Unpacking and checking our own assumptions, our own biases. And frames provide a really nice method, a really nice tool for analyzing those assumptions, for analyzing those biases, and for generating a bunch of different parallel universes, right? A bunch of different reasons behind clients' behavior, or behind the behavior of another stakeholder, or why something is happening in a particular case. The other piece that I really love about the frames is that it helps with counseling and co-creating with client. So because we center the lived experience of the client and the research that supports that lived experience of client in our use of frames, it really sets the client up as the expert, right? They are the expert on their own lives. They're the expert on what the goals should be in the case. And it helps position put students in a very client-centered mindset. And the last piece of it that I think is really critical is it introduces students to a tool of using interdisciplinary research. So they're picking up their case law or their case analysis and research tools in clinic, but we're also able, through the use of frames and how we construct them to using social science, to introduce the importance of interdisciplinary research as well, and incorporating that into their arguments and evidence that they may introduce at trial or during negotiations to try and accomplish clients' express interest. They're also student-centered, right? So often, and I think we're seeing this more and more, that our students come to clinic hungry to be part of, to disrupt more than to be part of systems, right? So they're coming in with hunger to be part of anti-racism movements, anti-subordination movements, anti-oppression movements, but they don't quite yet know how that applies to their individual cases. So the frames pedagogy helps introduce them to critical legal theory, and it helps introduce them to how individual casework can be part of these broader movements that they're really hungry to be a part of. Again, it's a transferable tool. So it gives students another tool for their tool belt for when they leave clinic, to be able to adopt and apply frames analyses to future situations. And then, to be honest, for us, it's fun. It's a richer pedagogy because now we can talk about all of these critical issues: race, adolescence, trauma and resilience, gender expression, orientation and identity, right? And we can weave these into our casework, and so it makes for a richer pedagogy as well.
All right. And of course, as you can imagine, we then are quite intentional about weaving frames into every aspect of our course design. So we just wanted to say a few words about how the frames appear and are woven through seminars, readings, supervision, and client representation. To start with the syllabus, we communicate the frames quite explicitly to our students in 3 ways through our syllabus. First, the syllabus, the introduction, the written introduction to the syllabus includes the 4 frames, right? Along with the course description and the learning goals. So it's part and parcel it's part and parcel of what the students see and understand the course to be about, right? Then the syllabus also explicitly names classes that will be devoted to constructing the various schema of a particular frame, right? So there'll literally be a class that may say race frame, or it will say adolescence, right? And I should tell you all that this is an evolution for us. As I said at the very beginning, our work on the frames has been evolving over a number of years. And it wasn't until recently that we said, wait a minute, let's just stop and like not only talk about it, write it down in the syllabus and make the syllabus quite visible, the frames quite visible in our syllabus. Also, the third thing is that the syllabus communicates the specific order in which we have chosen to explore the 4 frames, right? So they build upon each other in the ways in which we think they should naturally intersect. All right. So the syllabus slowly guides students to make the connection between the theory and the frame and the practical application of the frame, which I'll say more about in a second. But then throughout the syllabus, but also throughout the year, we have a year-long clinic, we have a series of substantive seminar classes specifically devoted to construing the various frames and preparing the students to use them. So, for example, during orientation, right, the very first week, in fact, the very first day, the very first session of our entire seminar course starts with an unpacking of normal adolescent development and implicit racial bias. And we do that class before we introduce ourselves, before we state the goals of the class. We literally walk in the door and we say, assume the role of the clients who you think you will be representing this year, right? And assume the role. And then we do a lot of role play. Happy to share with you guys if folks are interested in this activity. It's quite wonderful. We also have the students flip and play roles of different actors within the system and take on all of the assumptions that they bring to the table about our clients. So it's very rich discussion. That's right out the gate for the class. We also pair these seminar classes that I've just described with Black letter law classes. All right. So we pair a seminar, for example, on Fourth Amendment doctrine with a seminar that dives more deeply into implicit racial bias, policing and trauma, and the reasonable Black child standard. So how do we do that? Literally in 1 week, we meet twice a week. On a Tuesday, we might have the Fourth Amendment review, right? To get them ready to litigate Fourth Amendment issues. On Friday, we, in our heads, essentially repeat that class, but we repeat it through the lens of implicit racial bias, trauma, and the reasonable Black child standard. And it's also quite powerful. Students are like, wow. And so they're making that immediate connection. Readings, obviously we assign students readings related to the relevant themes. That includes law review articles, social science research, literature reviews, policy reports, and annotated bibliographies that we, the Georgetown Juvenile Justice Clinic, have created for students, summarizing that research so that they aren't in a clinic not only having to learn the law, research the law, and go out and find all the social science, right? We want them to be able to do that, but that's more than we can handle. So we have created these annotated bibliographies that we actually share with the world. So anybody who does juvenile legal work, they know they can access on our national toolkit. Because we loved the annotated bibliographies, we made them available nationally. We also have simulation-based courses populating throughout the year. So next slide on that. Eduardo. And so those simulation-based seminars actually give students an opportunity to practice and reinforce the frames in the context of direct client representations. So students might, mock exercises, anything from a disposition hearing to far more complex motions hearings, like a motion to suppress that really takes into account adolescent development. But one of our newest additions additions, you all, is a fact pattern that we started using last year, and we're really developing and using this year, this spring. So you have to ask us at the end of the semester how it's going. But we have one fact pattern that we are running through 4 classes, and we give the students an opportunity to stand on their feet and literally argue that social science, not just abstractly, not just anecdotally, but argue the research on implicit bias, the traumatic effects of policing, adolescent development. They argue that science in plain language to the judge. Again, strategically identified research, right? Intentionally placed research, only that research that advances the stated interest of our clients. We should note that we also have case rounds as a part of our course. And case rounds, literally the students come together as a collective, as opposed to just an individual clinic supervision. And they talk about the structural issues, the systemic issues that they see in their live cases. And then finally is the supervision, and that's the one-on-one supervision that allows us in individual meetings to highlight role assumption, case planning, and individual student reflection on what's happening in their cases. So this is just another way, as Eduardo said right at the beginning, that students often engage in frames analysis, either subconsciously or do so consciously, but incompletely. And so in supervision, we guide students to be more explicit, intentional, and extensive in their analysis of those frames and how to use them. And then finally, in those, in all of our seminars, specially designated seminars, and in individual supervision, we create space for students to name the systemic issues. Even though we are not a policy clinic, Eduardo hasn't said so, but he is our policy director. And he does a lot of our policy work, and we have classes set aside to engage students in how to do policy. So one of you said in the chat that you would wonder, why are SROs in the school in the first place? Indeed, that's one of the questions that we get students to arrive at on their own and name as a systemic issue. So that's where we'll stop with supervision. I think we'll say one word about client representation and close.
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, and then students get to practice it, and not just practice it, but do it. They are actively arguing in court on a suppression issue that the court should adopt a reasonable Black child standard, right? And trying to push and shape the law. And often, unfortunately or fortunately, we don't even have to get that far, because we have what's now a progressive prosecutor in the district. And so we're often making arguments to their office, and they're saying, oh, okay, actually, yeah, we agree with you. We'll dismiss that case. And so students are doing this throughout all levels of their actual client representation, arguing with probation officers or advocating with probation officers why they should shift their lenses, arguing with with prosecutors why the appropriate intervention is outside of the system, or arguing with judges that the law isn't neutral, and as a result, we need to adopt different standards that better reflect the lived experiences and reality of our clients, both on an individual level and on a population level. And so we will end there. Happy to answer any questions. Additionally, we've created a Google Drive folder that has a number of resources. It's not a public folder because I'm making everyone administrators so that they can add resources as they come across them as well. So if you'd like access to this folder, it's got some sample problems. It's got sample syllabi from various clinics who are using this frames concept. The article or the essay that Kris and I wrote, as well as some of the scholarship that we use to construct the schema that we use in our clinic, as well as articles that others use in there. So feel free to email me if you want access to that, and I will get you connected.
We're available for questions. We've been told we can sit in this space for a few more minutes, and so we're open if people have questions.
And thank you all for coming. I think Sarah's got a question.
Yeah.
I was just saying hi. Thank you very much.
Oh, we appreciate that. Hi.
Thanks for coming.
Good to see you. Oh, Carmia asked the question about the reasonable Black child standard. Maybe Eduardo can drop in the chat. Basically, we have been pushing an agenda that the reasonable, I mean, look, this part I'm gonna say is not new. A lot of people have been pushing the agenda that the reasonable man, the reasonable adult white male, educated, male should not be the standard that drives the law. Right. And as someone who spent a career working with youth, and in particular Black youth, the more I personally did the work, the more convinced that we needed not only a reasonable Black person standard, but we needed a reasonable Black child standard. And so that's what this is. And to be quite frank, we actually entered it from the opposite lens, which was the United States Supreme Court in JDB versus North Carolina, finally adopted a reasonable child standard explicitly in the law. And we realized how great and useful and effective that tool was in many legal questions, but it didn't go far enough for Black children. And so that hence the reasonable Black child. I wrote a law review article about that. I think Eduardo is looking maybe to find it. We could jot it in the chat, but there's an entire article, I forget where it's published, maybe the American University Law Review that fleshes that out. To be clear, I say to people, the reasonable Black child standard, because I work in a jurisdiction where all of our clients are Black, that is a slippery slope. I mean, that's how they would describe it. I caught myself. They would describe what I say as a slippery slope. I would say that the floodgates are open and should be open, right, to other reasonable standards, to have a more appropriate, objective, subjective standard in the law, particularly around critical questions of the Fourth and the Fifth Amendment, among many, many others. Yes. Other questions? Thank you, Nicole. Nicole says she's assigned our Frames article to her students. We have two, actually. They are reading it next week for the first time, so we're a little nervous about it. You're like, one, like, because now we're naming, but notice we did it, sort of second semester. So, we had them sort of experience it, find it themselves, and now we are starting the spring semester of our year-long clinic, naming what we've been doing. But we're thinking about what we'll do next year, whether we name it, because we do name it in the syllabus, whether we have them read the article even earlier. It was not published last semester, so.
Well, if there are no more burning questions, I know some folks are jumping off for their 1 o'clocks. I just want to thank you again, Kris and Eduardo. I mean, you are such spectacular teachers. I feel really nourished by this conversation and so excited about the semester to come and how I can incorporate some of these themes. And I know that extends to our broader audience. So thank you so much for being so generous with your time and your teaching and your resources to give us such an enriching presentation. Thanks to everyone for joining us. This recording will be up within the next week or so. I know I will be referring to it over and over again. So thanks again, and we will see you next time. Please refer to the CLIA website for all of the registrations to come.
Thank you all. Good to see so many friends.
Thank you all.
Take care.